It's good to be live, and it's good to have some people in the auditorium with me this morning. We have 7 other people joining us, all social distance around the auditorium. It's just great to be able to speak to live people instead of just a camera today. And for all of you at home, thank you for joining us as well. Hopefully, everything is working as well as it can, okay? Hey, you know what? Writer Cynthia Ozick, I think, said it best when she said, "We take for granted the very things that most deserve our gratitude." You know, it may have taken a pandemic for us to realize the things that we've been taking for granted for quite a while, but we sure do appreciate them more now than we did before. You know, the very phrase, to take something for granted, it means to accept without question or objection. And when you apply that to a person, it means to show no appreciation for or undervalue them. You know, this past week was Teacher Appreciation Week, and it took a pandemic for some parents, I think, to fully appreciate what teachers do each and every day during the school year. It's been so good to hear comments from so many different people about how much they appreciate teachers. Now, it took them staying at home for 2 months, trying to do their own teaching to their own kids online, but thank goodness they are showing some appreciation for the educational process. But back to Ozick's statement. You know, there's one group of people that we probably take for granted more than any other group, and they deserve a whole lot more gratitude and appreciation than we show them 364 days out of the year. You know, and of course that group that I'm talking about are mothers. So to all of the moms out there, let me just say this: Happy Mother's Day. And let me say just how much I appreciate all that you do 365 days a year. I am grateful that Anna Jarvis back in 1914 used her persuasive powers to help President Woodrow Wilson declare the second Sunday in May as a day when we make sure that we are showing our appreciation to all of the moms. So moms, I hope you're appreciated today, and I hope you feel more love than any other day of this year. You know, for me, I am aware that today is a bittersweet day, okay, when we celebrate Mother's Day, because I know that there are some ladies who would have loved to have been a mother, but for some reason just was not able to experience that. I also know that there are some whose mother was not a positive role model, and so there's negative memories of days like today. And then I know that there are also some whose mothers have maybe recently died, and there's a lot of emotion and a lot of pain that's felt today as well. Let me just say I acknowledge all of those feelings, and I'm sorry if those are some of the feelings that you're experiencing today, but maybe we can use today and the message of today to help us fully understand how much we can appreciate those people who are important in our lives. During our current message series, we've been looking at families in the Bible who allowed something to derail them, at least for a short period of time. And what we're finding is that God always wants to inject His grace into their lives if they let Him. I think we're going to find the same thing happening today as well. The story that we're going to look at today, at least from my perspective, is a husband who just took his wife for granted. And if it happened today the way that it did back then, my guess is there would be a whole new hashtag movement, okay, that would emerge as a result of this man's actions. And I got to be honest with you. As I read this story, I have questions about why God allowed the things to happen that He did. But again, I just have so much more to learn about God's ways and not just always follow man's ways. The story that we're going to look at actually has 2 chapters to it, but it's a very similar plot line, and the ending is the same in both chapters, and it's the story of Abraham and Sarah. So if you want to grab a Bible and turn with me to Genesis chapter 12, we'll start there, and then in a few minutes we will go to Genesis chapter 20 as well. And I think when I read both of these stories, both of these chapters, it just makes me want to scratch my head and say, Abraham, what were you thinking when you did this to your wife? Genesis chapter 12, read with me beginning in verse 10. Genesis chapter 12, verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. And as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife? Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Let's stop there for a second. And I don't know what your first reaction is to what Abraham did here, but in my opinion, it just wasn't real favorable. Now, he gets some brownie points, okay? There are some positives when he tells his 65-year-old wife, okay, this time she's 65 years old, how smoking hot she is, okay? That's a plus. But in my mind, there's a little negative that comes, okay? Guys, now, we probably could learn from Abraham. Okay, that, you know what, we need to tell our wives how beautiful they are more often than we do. But may we never, okay, go to the second thing that he does, which is, okay, honey, I want you to be a part of this little scheme that I have, this little deception that I want to do. And you know what, it's largely driven because I'm afraid. Now, why would Abram be afraid at this point? You know, if you back up a few verses and you look at the context that we're reading this in, I think what it does is it reveals to us that there's a deeper-seated problem in Abram's life than just his fear. You see, the beginning of chapter 12 records God's call of Abraham to leave his family and to follow him to a new place and produce through him a nation that will become God's people. And God will bless them, and they in turn will bless everyone else. Look at Genesis chapter 12, verse 4. It says, Abram did exactly what God told him to do. Now, you know, most of the time when we talk about Abraham, we talk about him being the father of faith because he demonstrated such great faith when he left his own family and followed God. In the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, he's talked about as a great faith example for all of us to follow. But I think this scene in Egypt begins to reveal some of the cracks in the early years of his faith. In fact, I think the cracks reveal the fear. And the fear is what led to the deception, and that's where I begin to see Abram taking advantage or taking his wife Sarah for granted. Now you might say, but Dave, that's how it always was back then. Men always took their wives for granted. You know what? You may be right on that. But I never see Jesus treating any woman or taking any woman for granted that he interacted with in the New Testament. Instead, what he did is he valued them, he appreciated them, no matter who they were. And so what that tells me is that God's plan from the start was for men not to take women for granted. A part of me really wishes that the writer of Genesis would have shared some of Sarah's feelings about this whole situation. And at the same time, I want to be very careful that I don't impose my feelings from a current culture onto her either. But as men, I think we need to continue to learn how not to take our wives and the women in our lives for granted. We can't just look at the Old Testament of what they did then. We have to look at what Jesus did in the New Testament as well, and to honor and appreciate those ladies in our lives. Now, some of you who know the whole story are maybe thinking, but Dave, this wasn't really total deception. I mean, Genesis chapter 20 tells us that Abraham and Sarah shared the same father but had a different mother. So in essence, it wasn't a total lie that she was his sister. But you know what? That raises a whole bunch of questions in our mind as well too, doesn't it? Back then, especially the female children of a second marriage to a man were oftentimes encouraged to be married to their stepbrother so that there could be a protection for that family and when it comes to the inheritance that was due to that family. Yeah, today we call it incestuous. Okay, let's just say it what it is. Call it what it is. But you know what? Back then things were different. And we can't put current judgment on those times, so we need to set that aside for now and trust that God knew what he was doing. Let's read on and see what God was doing. In Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 14, it says, when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that she was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, men servants and maidservants, and camels. Well, I guess Abraham was right. The Egyptians did see how hot she was, and the officials reported it to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh took her into his harem. Now, I probably forgot this, but one of the things that we need to understand about this whole process was that it was probably more political than physical. Because back then, whenever a ruler over a large area, there was a family that had great wealth and influence, it was common for them to take the women into their palace, primarily to form those alliances so that their power wouldn't be threatened. So really, Pharaoh taking Sarah into his palace, into his harem, was probably more political than it was physical, even though she was 65 years old and everybody thought she was beautiful. Pharaoh, quote unquote, adopts Sarah into his palace. But look what happens when he does that. Verse 17. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me, he said. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way, and his wife, and everything he had. You know, either Pharaoh was a really sharp guy, or there's some details in this story that are missing. I mean, how did he know that it was because of Sarai that all of these bad things were happening in his home? How did he connect the dots so quickly? And what would Abraham's response have been to him? You know what? None of those things are explained to us in this passage. But what we do hear is that he accumulated a lot of wealth, a lot of possessions, male and female donkeys and sheep and cattle and men servants and maidservants and camels, is what's talked about at the end of verse 16. So I guess one thing that we could note about this is that whether good or bad, Abraham acquired some influence and some wealth as a result of his little scheme. Okay, let's fast forward a few chapters to a second chapter in the life of Abraham and Sarah that I think sounds very, very similar to the first. Turn to Genesis chapter 20. Genesis chapter 20, beginning in verse 1, says this. Now Abraham, okay, his name has now gone from Abram to Abraham, moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed at Gerar. And there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, she's my sister. Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. Sounds like a rerun of chapter 12, doesn't it? But at least this time, some of those details are filled in for us, and we can connect the dots maybe a little bit better. Let's keep reading in verse 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, you are as good as dead. Because of the woman you have taken, she is a married woman. Now Abimelech had not gone near her, so he said, Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And didn't she also say, he's my brother? I have done this with a clear conscience and clean hands. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know you did this with a clean conscience, and so I have kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not return her, you may be sure that you and yours will die." Early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all of his officials, and he told them all that had happened, and they were very much afraid. Did you catch here what God did? He basically did something that he very rarely does in Scripture. He reaches out to a ruler or a king who really has no desire to follow him and no interest in him, and he injects grace into his life. It's kind of like what he did with Cain. Before he killed his brother Abel, he tried to inject grace and mercy so that that tragedy wouldn't happen. God basically does the same thing here. God made sure that Sarah was physically protected as well, so that the son that was born through Abraham would truly be the heir of the nation of God that he had promised. I guess it just goes to show, doesn't it, that God will go to almost any lengths to keep his promises. I think the next thing we read is from my perspective, a rightful request on Abimelech's part of Abraham about why he did what he did. Look at Genesis chapter 20, verse 9. It says, "Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, 'What have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you have brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that should not be done.' And Abimelech asked Abraham, 'What was your reason for doing this?'" Great questions, Abimelech. Verse 11, Abraham replied, "I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, 'This is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he's my brother.'" Did you catch that phrase? This is how you can show your love to me. Abraham's basically telling Sarah, if you love me, then you'll be a part of my little scheme of deception. Once again, the end is pretty good, even in this particular case. Genesis chapter 20, verse 14 says, "Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham, and he returned Sarah, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, 'My land is before you. Live wherever you like.' To Sarah he said, 'I am giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver.'" That's a ton of money, okay? No pun intended. That's a lot of money. "This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. You now are completely vindicated." Then Abram prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his slave girls, so that they could have children again, for the Lord had closed up every womb in Abimelech's household because of Abraham's wife, Sarah. I don't know about you, but again, God did things a little differently than I think we would have expected. But the results were still pretty much the same as what happened in Egypt, but with one slight difference. Did you catch that? Yeah, they acquired more wealth. God maintained the integrity of his lineage through Abraham. But this time, what did Abimelech do? He gave them a place of their own, a piece of land. You see, God had led them exactly to where he wanted them to be, because the land that Abimelech ruled over was the land that God had promised to him back at the beginning of Genesis chapter 12. And so already God is fulfilling his promise to give his nation a place to call home. God does things however he has to in order to keep his promises. And so as we look at this story of what I would say is a pretty dysfunctional period in the life of these two heroes of faith, I think the question becomes, what can we learn from them? Okay? What can we learn that we can actually apply to our own lives today? I came up with two things, okay? There's probably a lot more, but I came up with two. The first is that God will even use the times when we are weak in our faith to accomplish his greater purposes. God will use us when we are weak and we struggle with our faith because there's something greater that he wants to do in our lives. Like I said, Abraham was known for his faith. But I still think these two incidents reveal cracks in those early years when he was following God. Those cracks revealed the fear that I think was not trusting God, and therefore he leaned to deception and taking his wife for granted. But even in the midst of this, Abraham was blessed. He was blessed so that he could bless and use his influence for others. You know, God will use even the times when we feel like we have failed in our faith to fulfill something good. And we have to remember that. The second thing is that God uses the times when we are weak in our faith to strengthen our faith in the future. Abram may have acted in fear in his early sojourn with God, but by the time his son Isaac was born, I don't see him taking God for granted. I don't see him taking his wife for granted. I see him only living by faith. My guess is that had Egypt and Gerar not happened in Abram's life, he never would have been able to do what he did in Genesis chapter 22. See, God uses those experiences to help Abraham become strong in his faith to the point where he was even willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. Just like the song that we sang a few minutes ago, God is always faithful to us. And when we stop and notice just how faithful he's been to us, that, I think, can make our faith grow stronger. So I ask you, when were the times in your life when you were like Abraham? And maybe you didn't trust God as much as you could have. Your faith wasn't as strong as it should have been. And maybe you led to things like deception and taking people for granted and things like that. When did that happen in your life? But even if it did, look back and see how faithful God was to you during those times. Let me close this morning by asking, or by just simply saying how much I appreciate the faith of those mothers and women that I have watched over the course of my lifetime. Some of you have struggled with your faith at different times, and you were taken advantage of, and you were taken for granted, and yet you still continued to demonstrate great faith and great trust in God. Let me just say this. Your influence wasn't just on your kids. It was on a lot of other people as well. And so I say thank you for that this morning. I asked my wife Sharon, I said, honey, were there ever some times where you felt like I took you for granted? And bless her heart, she's either getting forgetful as she grows older, or she's just becoming more gracious, okay? I'm going to go with option 2. Because she said, you know what, I really can't remember any times that you took me for granted. And if they were probably in the early years of our relationship. And so, honey, thank you for your grace. I'm sure there have been those times when I have done that. But you know what? Your faith has strengthened me as well. So today, I thank all of you gracious women. And I say thank you for what you have done to create hope and faith and encouragement in my life and in every man's life. So may we do our best today to never take you for granted, and may we always show you the appreciation that you deserve.